quiet, yay! So we're really happy that you're here, Dawn, and welcome to Maggie this morning. Yeah, that's so great. We're going to delve into the book of Ruth today, and Asher is going to read a part of chapter 4 of the book of Ruth. So Asher, you want to come up and read for us? And which microphone should Asher use? He's got his own. Awesome. All right, he's ready. All right, good.
It's already on.
Oh. Then all the Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make a woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow name in Bethlehem. Together and through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you to this day without a next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel, and he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women in the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David.
Thanks, Asher. Not only was he willing to stand up and read in front of everybody, which is awesome, he also got like 9 weird Bible names in there. So way to go. So last week we introduced the story of Ruth, and if you happen to have, I think there's a few Bibles scattered around, or if you have a phone that has a Bible app or a device that has some sort of Bible app on it, you're welcome to open that, and we're gonna go through the rest of the story today. But I want to just take a couple minutes to remind us of some things we talked about last week, or if you weren't here last week, to introduce the story of Ruth a little bit. Before we jump into the rest of the story, and Asher read the end of it, so now you know what's going to happen at the end. Let's go back to the beginning for a minute. This book starts with and revolves around the experience of immigration, or being a foreigner, being a stranger in a strange land. So at the beginning of the story, Naomi and her 2 sons and husband move from Bethlehem, where there's a famine, to Moab, which was the enemy country of Israel. Up on the screen, you'll see, by the way, an artist, a Chinese artist who's produced a lot of biblical art, and this is his story of Ruth and Naomi. And I love that it's not obvious. So during this time, you can kind of look at it and see how you see Ruth and Naomi in that painting. So they moved to Moab, which is one of Israel's biggest enemies. In today's terms, we call them refugees. The United Nations defines a refugee as someone who has to flee their country because of persecution or war or natural disaster. And that makes Naomi and her family sorts of, refugees. Now, while they're there, Naomi's 2 sons and husband die. And Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth, decide to move back to Israel. So on both ends of this story, somebody's a stranger. Somebody doesn't belong. Naomi and her husband and sons don't really belong in Moab. When Naomi and Ruth go back to Israel, Ruth doesn't really belong in Israel. So this whole story comes from the experience of being a stranger, being a foreigner, not belonging, and not necessarily being welcomed. Number 2, this story was written, we think, at least some people think this story was written during a time when Israel, as a country, was having a big discussion about who really belonged in their country and what made somebody a real Israelite. Because at least some scholars believe that this book was written as the people of Israel were making their way back from exile in Babylon and reestablishing their country. And in that time, they had a lot of questions about identity. Who really makes up this country of Israel? How foreign can you be and still really be an Israelite? Does this sound familiar to anybody? There were arguments about preserving Israel for the real Israelites and kicking out all the people who didn't belong. And at some point during that time, somebody looked way back in Israel's history, and they found the story of King David, probably the greatest Israelite king of all time, King David's great-grandmother, who just happened to be a Moabite. Which is kind of like if somebody right now looked back in American history and wrote the story of the great-grandmother of George Washington, except that she happened to be like a member of Al-Qaeda. That's 100 historical inaccuracies right there. But the point is, this is the story of a foreigner, an enemy, as someone who makes your country possible. That's the story the Bible chooses to tell us in the midst of this argument about who really belongs. When you're having that argument, the love story that the Bible tells us is that you cannot be a people, you cannot be a nation, you cannot get to your future without the immigrants, the refugees, and the foreigners. There's no future without them. That's the story the Bible tells. Okay, so that was chapter 1. And now we're going to get to the rest of the story. Dun, dun, dun. So Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth have returned to Israel, and they don't have too much hope for their future. Ruth had no children during her time that she was married. Naomi was a foreigner in Ruth's land, and now Ruth is a foreigner in Naomi's land. Either way, no matter where they go, somebody's going to not belong. And the ordinary kind of future that most people hope for in life, having children and grandchildren to continue your family line, doesn't look like it's going to happen for Ruth and Naomi. They are about the most vulnerable you can get in the world they live in. They are widows and they are immigrants. These are two of the categories that God is most concerned about. So in the Old Testament, when God tells the people of Israel to take special care of the most vulnerable people, God always names them as widows, orphans, and immigrants, or sometimes foreigners and strangers in your land. Those are the people that God really wants Israel to keep an eye out for. They're like the canary in the mine, God says. When those people aren't doing well, then you're not doing well. But God has to command that because those folks are always on the edge. There's not much protection for them. So Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, the city that they left years ago. And it's the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, part of the protection that God commanded for these vulnerable folks, for widows, orphans, and immigrants, is that people who own land should not harvest it to the very edges. So they should leave a little, don't color all the way to the lines, right? They should leave a little bit around the edge of the field so that people who don't have any way to feed themselves can come after the harvest is done for the day, and they can take what's been left around the edges. It's kind of the first welfare system, right? Leave a little left over for people who don't have anything. This is called gleaning. And by the way, it's a practice that's still done. In my parents' congregation, they host a weekly Wednesday night dinner, and the way they get food for that dinner, for the community, it's a free dinner, is that they have a team of gleaners who go to grocery stores and restaurants and farmers markets and say, do you have anything left over? And what they give is what they make the meal out of every week. It's gleaning. People still do it. So Ruth, or as you might remember for this from last week, as the story always calls her, because we don't want to forget where she's from, Ruth the Moabite, right? Her name's not Ruth. No one can just call her Ruth. They always have to call her Ruth the Moabite. Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi, look, I will go and glean us something to eat. I will go find a field and I will harvest stuff to eat. So she does. She finds a neighboring field that happens to belong to a man named Boaz. Boaz just happens to be a relative of Naomi's. And Boaz notices Ruth, who's out there around the edges of the field. And he asks his workers, "Who is this young woman?" And they tell him two things about her. What do you think the first thing they say about her is? She's a Moabite. Yep, good job. You paid attention. That's right. Number one, well, she's a Moabite. That's what we know about her. Right? She's a Moabite. And she's the one who came back with Naomi from Moab. So Boaz now knows two things about Ruth. One, she's a Moabite, right? She's from an enemy country, because that's what everybody knows about Ruth. And two, that she has made a risky and unusual choice to leave her homeland and come to Israel with her mother-in-law, to whom she's bound in no real official way, because the son who bound them together is gone. Ruth was in no way obligated to come back with Naomi. In fact, it made no sense at all that she did. And yet, this is something Boaz now knows about her. We, the readers, know something about Boaz. We know one thing about him. And that's that the story describes him as a man of worth. Now, if you look up in most Bibles, many Bibles, you look up that verse, the man of worth, most Bibles translate that as a prominent rich man. Is that the same thing? That's one of the questions the story is now going to want us to ask ourselves. What does it mean to be a person of worth? Is it about your money? Or is it about something else? So hold on to that for a little bit. Ruth comes back home, brings what she's gleaned to Naomi. They eat, which must have felt great that they found something to eat. And then Ruth mentions, oh, by the way, I found this stuff in the field of Boaz. And Naomi realizes something. That this might be a way forward. This might be a future for them that was unthinkable just a short time ago. Because Boaz can do something for them. He doesn't have to, but he can. The story calls Boaz a kinsman. There's a lot of air quotes in this story, or maybe it's just me. I don't know. I need an air quote Bible. More later on the air quotes, but just a second. So Naomi has discovered that Boaz can do something for them because he's a kinsman. And in Hebrew, that is the word goel, which shouldn't mean anything to you, except that if you've ever been in a church where they were singing old-fashioned hymns, usually kind of slowly, that you might have sung a hymn that goes like this: I know that my Redeemer lives. Anybody ever sung that hymn? At a funeral sometimes. Yeah. Redeemer is the word goel, kinsman. That's what that word is. And a goel, a redeemer, has a particular role in a family, or option in a family. It's the goel's job to marry a widowed woman in the family so that she can have children. And this was usually brothers. Usually, if a man's brother died and his wife is left with no children, he marries her so that she can have children, and those children would be considered her husband's children. This gives her a chance at a future. That's what it means to redeem somebody, to give them a chance at a future. Boaz isn't Ruth's brother-in-law. Their relationship isn't that close, but he is a kinsman. He can do this if he wants. There is now a possibility of a future that they thought was gone. So Naomi hatches a plan. You have to do this like Mr. Burns in The Simpsons, which dates me. But anyway, Naomi hatches a plan. So remember that question we came up with earlier this morning. What is a time when you took a risk, and how did it turn out? I mean, the thing about risk is that by definition, you don't know how it's going to turn out when you're doing it. You might triumph, you might lose everything. You might land someplace in between. But if you go down, you're going to go down swinging for the seats. And that's what Naomi proposes. I'm going to show a picture of the setting of chapter 3 of Ruth. It's a threshing floor. Wow. It's not very exciting, but nevertheless, this is an ancient threshing floor in Nazareth that somebody discovered, that archaeologists have discovered. And it might not mean much to us, but the threshing floor, which is the setting of chapter 3 of Ruth, was a happening place during harvest time. So imagine being in a small town where there's a lot of family farms, and on the main street of this small town, there's a bar. And during harvest time in the evenings, this bar is full in the evenings of sweaty, tired, happy farmers whose work is done for the day. There will be more work tomorrow, because there always is, but they're looking forward to having a beer with their buddies. Now multiply that by 100, and you have the threshing floor, where the guys got pretty drunk, and the parties were loud and infamously obnoxious, and the only women who ever went near this place were the prostitutes, looking to make a little money during harvest time. This is where Naomi sends her daughter-in-law, her foreign, widowed daughter-in-law. She tells her to go wash and anoint herself, like put perfume, get dressed up, and go to the threshing floor and wait for Boaz to finish eating or drinking. She says, watch where he lies down, or like falls over, as the case may be. And when he's asleep, go and uncover his feet, and he will tell you what to do. And just in case you think that Naomi is forcing Ruth into this plan, Ruth goes, sure. She just signs right up. Okay, all that you tell me I will do, she says. There's no like, are you, that's, sure. Nope. So let's pause for a moment and remember that by the time we get to what Asher read, by the time we get to the end of this story, we will know that Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David, that greatest king of Israel, one of its treasured heroes. And where did David come from? How did he come to be? David's royal family continues when it almost met its end in these two women, because his great-grandmother and his great-great-grandmother decided to risk everything on this ridiculous, dangerous, morally questionable, possibly disastrous plan of dressing like a prostitute, acting like a prostitute, and hoping that the kindness that Boaz had shown Ruth by letting her glean in his field, that kindness was so ingrained in who Boaz was, that's what made him a man of worth, that would determine how he acts toward Ruth on this threshing floor. So Ruth lays down. She does exactly what Naomi says. She dresses up. She goes to the threshing floor. She waits for Boaz to be asleep. And she lays down next to his feet. Now, this is the part where I tell you something that you cannot unknow once you know it. So sorry about that. But pretty often, when the Bible talks about feet, this is where we need an air quote Bible. It's not feet, right? That's not, she doesn't lie down next to his feet. So you can run with that. You know what that is, right? And then she just waits for him. In the middle of the night, Boaz wakes up. And he sees her, but it's dark, so he doesn't really know who this is. And when he asks who this is that's lying down next to him, Ruth says to him, "Will you be my redeemer? Will you be my Goel, my next of kin?" Now, in this moment, all of the power and the privileges in this story are with Boaz. He has all the power in this moment. He can do whatever he wants to Ruth, and no one will blame him, and probably, frankly, no one will even know about it. He can choose. He can choose. And he turns to Ruth and he says to her, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. I will do as you ask. For all the assembly of my people will see that you are a woman of worth. What does it mean to be a person of worth? We asked that earlier. And now we get to ask it again. Boaz, the story says, is a man of worth, and now he calls Ruth the very same thing. And he calls her this as she's behaving in a way that is, let's just say, profoundly unladylike and terribly risky. She's broken all the moral codes, and yet it's exactly that risk that makes the future possible, that makes her a woman of worth. This is the story of David's family, the king of Israel, and it's not a story of people who behave themselves and follow the rules. What does it mean to be a person of worth? Well, at least in Ruth's story, above all, it means to act with steadfast love, with faithfulness to the need and the humanity of the person who's next to you, even when that means behaving in ways that other people might find weird or countercultural or even bizarre. Because when we get to the end of the story, the part that Asher read for us earlier, we hear that unbelievably, against all the odds, all the terrible losses that marked the beginning of the story, the death of husbands, the death of sons, the death of a future, those things are not the end of the story. What Asher told us is that at the city gate, the most public place there is, all of the people of this town gather around Ruth, the Moabite, and Naomi, who thought she had no future, and Boaz, who chose to redeem and live with and marry this woman, even though he could have walked away from her. All the people will gather around this motley little family, and they will say to them, "May the Lord make you like our greatest matriarchs, Rachel, Leah. May you, Ruth, the Moabite, may you bear the children who will become our future. And may your family be a blessing, as you have been to us." I want to leave you with this one last, well, not one last thing, but some last thoughts. I always feel like in a sermon you should get to a point where you tell people, this is what I want you to remember, this one thing. If you could take away this one thing, then yay, that's great. But I think part of the beauty and glory of the story of Ruth is that there's no way to get it to one thing. There's no one lesson in this story. There are so many ways to hear it, so many questions for us, so many ways to be changed and transformed by the story of this family that we can't just limit it to one thing. So what does the story mean for you? That's the question for you to ask yourselves this week. What does it mean for you to be a person of worth? What kind of risks are we willing to take for the sake of our vulnerable neighbors, including the immigrants and the orphans and the widows in our midst? What will it look like for you to live out of steadfast love, even when the privileges that you have mean that you could do what you want and no one will know? What future are you a part of? Because you choose to do the small things every day that God invites you to do. What does it mean for you that God's future comes not by war or battles won or clever speeches or perfect morality, but through the lives and decisions of ordinary people and ordinary families and regular lives? What does it mean for you that every family has weird stories and not just yours? These are all, and there are so many more, but these are the questions that Ruth the Moabite will not let us forget. So as the band comes forward to continue our worship together, I invite you to live with those questions this week. To ask yourself what this love story will mean for you.